We're in Judges chapter 6, and as you turn there, I want to say thank you for these morning sessions. I've done, over the years, several gospel meetings where they have either very early morning sessions, like over in Double Springs, or a little later sessions, and a few that have done after lunchtime sessions. And I always appreciate them for a couple of reasons. One, it is a little more intimate, a little smaller crowd, and I kind of like that. I know sometimes preachers act like they always like big crowds, but it's an opportunity to get to know you perhaps a little bit better. And as Ronnie said, it's a time where you don't maybe necessarily preach the same sort of sermonic material you would preach in a gospel meeting at a nighttime service. I can't fully describe why that is, but it seems to allow itself to build a little bit. And so that's what we've been doing as we look at Gideon in Judges chapter 6. If you have not been at the morning session so far, just to kind of bring you up to speed, when we find Gideon, 135,000 Midianites have surrounded the Israelite army, and they're in fear. They're hiding in caves, and they're in that cycle that we've talked about. They're in the cycle of repentance, beginning to get in that cycle. God's going to help them come to repentance as he uses Gideon, but they realize they're not doing right, and they're not doing well because they're not doing right. And you have this very ordinary person in Gideon. And I say ordinary in the sense that he is like every other Israelite. He too is hiding in caves. Instead of threshing wheat out in the open where you would thresh wheat, he's in a wine press threshing wheat and seems to be in fear like every other Israelite. He's ordinary. And we've talked about the 4 steps that God uses when he decides to use a person. Number 1, we talked about Gideon's affirmation, about how God affirmed Gideon. He appears to him and calls him a mighty man of valor, when on the surface it appears Gideon is anything but a mighty man of valor. But I would remind you that God sees in us what we do not see in ourselves, and that ought to give us some confidence. We said second, there is God's revelation. When God appears to Gideon, then we said during this time, God waits on Gideon, and we discussed how marvelous that thought is. That the God of all the universe cares so deeply about the people of this universe that God himself would take time to wait on man. And third, we talked about Gideon's confrontation. There is a spiritual confrontation. What God is he going to serve? The gods of Baal, Ashereth Pole, or the God of heaven, and that God will not take second place. We said there is Gideon's, there is not only a spiritual confrontation, it's a physical confrontation. He has to go and tear down that pole. And then there is an emotional confrontation. That Ashereth pole was in his dad's backyard. It was his dad's, apparently, and it's very emotional in all likelihood for Gideon to have to go against family. It's true for most any of us that have ever had to stand against someone in our family over a spiritual matter. Today we're going to close this lesson out, and we're going to talk about the 4th step when God chooses to use a person. And so if you'll look at verse 34, you have Gideon's transformation. Before we go into verse 34, I want to say again, thank you for your kindnesses to me. I've been doing this for a very long time. In fact, the first gospel meeting I preached was 35 years ago in April. And so I've been doing these but I'm still learning. And I learn everywhere I go, and I learn from you, and I appreciate it when someone teaches me something that I can use in the future. So thank you so much. So Gideon's transformation. Verse 34 says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. Now he's ready for service. He's ready to be a leader. There is a marvelous transformation in his life, and we will see it in the next few verses. I would remind you what we said on Sunday, God plus 1 always equals a majority. Gideon now realizes he will have power, and as a result of that, he will have confidence, and he will have the strength to take on the mighty, fearful army of the Midianites. An important point here is that power in the Christian life seems to always come after testing, not before. Sometimes we think it's all going to be simple. But to paraphrase the old song, God never promised us a rose garden. He never said that everything in the Christian life would be easy. There will be challenges. And in the rest of the story of Gideon, in chapter 6 and chapter 7, you have this amazing conclusion of this historical event. Gideon goes out and he blows a trumpet. Now you think of this tremendous influence of this fearful, quaking guy a few verses before. He goes out and he blows a trumpet and he hollers that everybody rally around for God and for Israel. And thousands of people rally around a man that a few weeks before was in the bottom of a wine press hiding out. He cries out, "Who wishes to follow the Lord into battle?" Now you think about this. 32,000 people show up. Imagine that. 32,000 people. I don't know if anyone in this room has ever considered running for a public office. But I hate politics. Just be very clear about that. I don't do politics. But I enjoy watching the political ramifications and fallout. And one of the things I like to watch when I watch the returns is I like to watch the names, not of the big guys and the big people that run, but of the small people. The guy that ran for governor and he got 12 votes. It's like, well, he had 12 people, out of a couple of million people. How many people do you think you could rally if you decided to run for office, if you decided to lead something marvelous? 32,000 people. That is a significant number of people. I hope this is said correctly. Gideon, if he's human at all, had to be a little proud. I built an army. A few weeks ago, everybody was scared to death, and now I built an army. It's a small army. Well, no, it's 32,000. Yeah, it's a small army. There are 135,000 Midianites, and they're camped in the valley in their tents, and it's 32,000 people. Still grossly is underrated compared to 135,000 people. But you know the story. You're ahead of me already. God said, that's too many people. And God says that for one reason. God wants to make sure that no one thinks that Gideon is the reason they win this victory or that they're the reason they win this victory. Everyone will know this is God's work, not their work. So Gideon tells the 32,000 people, everybody who is afraid to go into war with the possibility of having your head cut off and put on a pole by the Midianites, historically, that's what history says the Midianites like to do. Everybody who's afraid of them, you go home. God tells Gideon to tell the people that. And I like to think there were 22,000 honest people that day because 22,000 went home. Evidently, people then were a lot like people today. God said, that's still too many. Do a test. Take them down the river. And those who get down and lay out straight to drink water like a dog, you send them home. Those who hold their spear to their side and lap water with their hands, you tell them to stay. Now, if you had asked me how many people would do one or the other, I would have thought it would be, roughly 50-50. But as you know, it wasn't. 97% of the people, 9,700 people were sent home. And Gideon has to, at this point, feel a little unusual, right? I had an army of 32,000 people, God, and now I've got 300 folks. 300 men versus 135,000. Anybody know what those odds are? Anybody really good with math? It's 450 to 1. 451. I didn't come up with them on. Somebody else did the tabulation there. Those aren't very good odds. But God invented math. God knows math. And God wanted to make it clear, this is my person. I hesitate to tell this story because it will take a few minutes to tell. But my fear is that oftentimes those of us who are Christians do not do anything because we don't think we can do much. So I'm a little bit of a baseball fan. I've become a baseball fan. And in baseball, they have what they call a 5-tool player. Anybody know what a 5-tool player is? Ronnie, you know what a 5-tool player is? Any baseball aficionados out there? Nobody knows what a 5-tool player is? He can hit for power or average. No, he can hit for average, he can hit for power. He can field, he can pitch, and he can throw. 5 tools. And there aren't many 5-tool players. And a lot of people debate who is a 5-tool player and who isn't. The last one that probably has really been a 5-tool player was a guy named Ken Griffey Jr. Ken Griffey started with the Seattle Mariners, did some traveling around, came back, finished his career with the Mariners. At the end of his career with the Mariners, people said, and in his last few years, he led his team in every major statistical category. But the fans were not happy with him. You know why? He was a 5-tool player. They didn't want him to lead his team in every statistical category. They wanted him to lead the league in every statistical category. The problem with being a 5-tool player is everybody thinks you can do anything. Most of us in this room do not believe we are 5-tool players spiritually. We think I can't do much. The danger is that we begin to think, since I can't do much, I'm not going to do anything. My friend Barbara was a dear, dear lady. When she came to visit us at Granny White, she was nearly 80 years young. She came to see us on a Sunday night. On Monday, my friend Ronnie and I went to visit Barbara. In visiting Barbara, I got in her house. Ronnie and I got in her house, sat down. She said, I'm going to start coming to Granny White. She said, but I want you to know, and she pointed her finger at me, you're not my preacher. I thought, okay. She said, Bill McIntyre is my preacher. I said, okay, I love Brother McIntyre. I'm fine with that. She said, you're not my backup preacher. Gary Dodd is my backup preacher. You get to be third. I thought, okay, well, fine. I didn't ask for that or anything else, but that's fine. The church started looking for a new secretary, an additional secretary, and I think the elders had something in for me. They hired Barbara. Barbara became one of the secretaries. She tolerated me, and I tolerated her. I tried to care for her. She tried to care for me, but we were not alike at all. In a few years, I left Granny White. I'd not been gone long when I get an email from Miss Barbara. She said, do you know that Gladys Montgomery is in the hospital? Gladys was 99 years young. I wrote her back, and I said, I do not. She wrote back, I did not. She wrote back, and she said, why not? I wrote her back, and I said, because I'm not her preacher. I didn't really say that. I wrote her back and said, I'm not at Granny White anymore. I'm in another congregation. I let them, she said, she would like for you to come see her. I said, okay, I will. And she said, would you like for me to email you and keep you up on what's going on? I thought that'd be nice. Over the next 7 years, I averaged 8 emails a day from her, 7 days a week. At some point, I wrote her and I said, Barbara, I don't read forwards. She wrote me back and she said, okay. And then she started forwarding things to my wife, Melanie, and saying, share this with Dale. So I got those. But she kept me up. At one point, she wrote me and she said, I'm an old lady now. I can't drive any longer. I can't get out at night. I can't prepare meals for people like I used to. And she said, I just can't do much. And she said, but I can pray. And she said, I know you speak a lot. And if every Saturday you would write me and write where you're speaking and what you're speaking on and give the exact time while you're preaching, I will pray for you and for the people listening. And I do not understand all the intricacies of God and deity and spirituality and everything about how prayer works. But regardless of that, my preaching, I think, took on an additional power during that time. And she would pray. The difference between Barbara and most people is she said, I can't do much, but I want to do what I can. And many people say, I can't do much, and so they become pew sitters and they don't do anything. Postscript of the story, Barbara died about 3 years ago. And her niece, she had no children. Her niece wrote me and said, or called me and said, Barbara died. And I knew she was at the point of death. I'd seen her in the hospital a few days before. And she said she left very explicit instructions in her material about how her funeral's to be conducted, and that didn't surprise me. She was very meticulous. And she said she wants you to preach the funeral. So just, I got to be her preacher. It worked out well. Well, again, the challenge we have is to do what we can. The 5-tool player thinks it's all about him. I can do anything. Most of us, because we're not 5-tool players, end up not doing anything if we're not careful. Well, back to the story. God says, Gideon, here are the tools you're going to need. Now, I'm going to paraphrase greatly here, so beware of that. Gideon says, okay, God, tell me what I need to get. And Gideon gets out his little notebook and his pen. See, I'm paraphrasing. And Gideon says, all right, God, go. I'm ready to take your list down. And God says, Gideon, give everyone a trumpet. And Gideon thinks, okay, I don't know how that'll help us in battle, but okay, trumpet. All right, God, what else? Give everyone a torch. Okay, torch. All right, God, what else? And God is silent. I've taught this class to 5th grade boys before. And you ask the 5th grade boys, what equipment do you want to go into battle? None of them ever say a trumpet and a torch. You ought to hear the things they do say. It's quite the list. But that's all. That's everything. Standard issue weapons. A horn and a clay pot. I said a torch. A clay pot, excuse me, I'm sorry. So in the middle of the night, Gideon takes his little band of 300 men. He circles a valley. They spread in a complete circle around the Midianites. And each man has his torch lit under the clay pot. And God says to Gideon, when I say go, you tell the men to blow their trumpets, to break the pots, and to say, for the Lord and for Gideon. And they'll make a noise so that they won't know what it is, and it will scare them. And the little band of 300 will seem like thousands, and the Midianites will turn on each other. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. God told Gideon. Gideon gave the shout. They blew the trumpets. They cried out. They broke the pots. The light shone out. The Midianites woke up, running around the middle of the night in their pajamas on and their swords, and began to fight each other. Everybody got out their swords. And watch it, over 100,000 Midianite enemies of God's people died that day as the Israelites stood there and watched. Psychological warfare to the finest. And the little group looked like thousands, and it was a tremendous victory. And Gideon becomes a national hero, someone who a few weeks before couldn't tie his own shoes, so to speak. Do you think that God could use you like that? Man, I can't see myself in that role. Well, maybe that's why. Maybe you need affirmation. You need to be reminded that the God of heaven sent his Son to die for you. That we love him not because we're great, but because he first loved us. Or maybe you're at that time where you need to have a revelation from God. And the way God reveals himself today, Hebrews chapter 1 says, he's spoken to us through his Son. And we hear his Son through his word. God will reveal himself to any who seek him. Third, maybe you're ready for the test. Maybe you're in the middle of a test and you don't know why things are hard and difficult right now in your life. Perhaps it's because you needed that time to be tested and have your faith tested so you could come out stronger to face and to do whatever God has planned for your life. Or maybe you're at stage 4 and you're ready for the fight, you're ready for the battle. God can use ordinary people, and he can use you for his goodness and for his kingdom and for his glorification. Today, if you're not a Christian, we urge you to accept the revelation of God, to do what he has said, to obey the gospel, to turn from sins, to confess Jesus, and to be baptized. And today, if you're his child and you've stopped living for him, This day you need to come home. Will you come while we stand and sing?